Hello and welcome. Today we're going to be talking about the influence of the family upon development. This chapter introduces parenting and parenting styles, just to kind of delve into the chapter. But before we do this, we need to consider a few things. One, this is going to be very complex, and no matter how long and how much I talk, I'll only be able to scratch the surface of the influence of parents upon developing children, and also the influence of the social context upon parents who then influence their children and so on and so forth. And then, such as how the socioeconomic status of your parents is associated with overall life outcomes. So again, just to introduce this is all very complex, and I don't know how if I can stress that enough times, but even beginning to lecture on something like this, it's almost a question of where do you even begin? But the book begins with parenting and parenting styles, and it asks questions like, how do parenting styles structure kids? How is parenting styles, or how are parenting styles associated with how well your children turn out, how well they're disciplined, how well they're creative? What about their attachment styles? Have you traumatized your kids? Have you made them happy? Did you spoil your kids too much? We have so many questions. Again, we've talked that there is no book on parenting. It's not like parents are handed a book and they know everything about how to parent. And so we all have to kind of figure it out as we go, and we observe from others how to be parent, and then we kind of have our natural genetics influencing how we're parents, and our personalities and our temperaments influencing our parenting styles. Again, it's all so complex. But just to break it down into some easy categories to get us started, the book talks about four types of parenting styles. And again, I'm a big critique always when it comes to things like stage theory or trying to categorize things into nice, neat little boxes. Like there are four parenting styles only. That's not the case. Even the book is quite clear that most of us express or adapt aspects of all of these at times, for example, or just some of them, or just one of them. Maybe some of us really are just singular in our parenting styles. But again, can we just neatly put these all into a box is always the question we're going to ask. But for authoritative parents, the book describes it as parents who are supportive and show interest in their kids' activities, but are not overbearing and allow them to make constructive mistakes. Parents allow negotiation where appropriate, and consequently, this type of parenting is considered more democratic. But again, is that enough? Do kids need discipline? Do we need the authoritarian parent, the traditional model of parenting in which parents make the rules and children are expected to be obedient? You know, don't speak until spoken to kind of thing. Parents tend to place maturity demands on their children that are unreasonably high and tend to be aloof and distant. However, maybe some of us are permissive, involving holding expectations of children that are below what could be reasonably expected of them. Let them find their own way. Ditch the Vygotskian theory about becoming a rocket scientist and having to push the kids, and just let them play as they may and find their own way in this world. Children are allowed to make their own rules and determine their own activities. Parents are warm and communicative, but provide little structure for their children. Again, we have to ask, how much structure do kids need? How much creativity and free time and exploration do they need? Do they need discipline sometimes? But is too much discipline a bad thing? Because then that blocks them from being able to go out in the world and find their own way. Your book has several critiques of all of these. And then finally, we have uninvolved parents that are disengaged from their children. They do not make demands on their children and are non-responsive. And the book talks about how the effects of things like neglect upon children can, affect their school behavior, problem behavior, overall emotional development, things along those lines. But then we have to ask, okay, we have these parenting styles. What's the point of talking about it? We're in developmental psychology. How does types of parenting styles affect kids? So again, if you raise kids to be super disciplinary, how do they turn out? Is that the best method? Or should we become more somewhere in between where we kind of give them structure, but we allow them to make mistakes and kind of find their own way? Or should we just be like completely who cares, let them do what they want kind of person? They can go jump in a mud puddle and that's totally fine. Kids covered in mud. As a parent, that's always your worst nightmare. It's like having a dog that comes in covered in mud, and then they sit on your couch and it's all over, or they got popsicle over their face, and then you have to put them in a car, or they have their ice cream and they want to bring it, but you're trying to go, and so they have like half of their ice cream left in the car, and then that's just a disaster. But again, how do these different parenting styles affect kids? How do parents affect their kids? Again, what happens to kids who don't receive the support from their parents? What happens to kids who receive too much support? Are they trying to run away? I just gotta get out of my own. I feel like even if my parents live in Ohio, I better live in Maine or New York just to be hundreds of miles away from the overbearing helicopter parents that I have. So again, to each their own. There is no answer to what's the right or wrong way. The best answer is, how is the kid, are they happy? Are they loved? Are they comfortable? Have they eaten today? Do they have a smile on their face? Do they seem to be progressing in a reasonable manner? If they're not, do we need to do some kind of an intervention, for example, to help the kid? Whatever it might be, but how we observe development and how we observe what's the best parenting style, again, is very arbitrary. It's us coming up with this measure of what's the best. And, again, is there a best way to do anything? It's just a philosophical question. So when it comes to parenting, is there one best way? Or is it good to have some mixed methods where sometimes you're harsh and stern because you have to? Kids can get really hurt if you just let them go run out in the street in the middle of the city whenever they want to, for example. But again, are we being overbearing when the kids are being a little bit too loud and all of a sudden we're screaming at our children and telling them to be quiet and sending them to their room for being too loud? Again, and so how we structure our parenting styles, how we structure discipline, all of this in the end will affect kids. It is the parents who are the primary agents of socialization. It is parents who are the first ones who teach their kids values, norms, belief systems, languages, how to talk, how to walk, how to dress, what's proper behavior. It is us that imposes our cultural way of life on our kids and expect them to follow along with it. So what is the goal of parenting in the first place, right? It's to raise our kids to be able to walk around in this society, in this social context, and know how to negotiate the social world to the extent that they can go find food and shelter. And if they have their own kids, take care of them or take care of anybody else like animals or friends that they might need to take care of, whatever it might be. However, we can raise a productive citizen, whatever that looks like, and whether or not citizen is even the right word, because some people are like, I'm just kind of would rather be in the woods without all this government and stuff. So again, how do we raise a productive human, you know, is the goal. But again, what is productive? How do we define what is productive? Is it some kid who's great at math, some kid who's great at art, some kid who's great at being a friend, some kid who's just really great at playing poker? I mean, how do we define what we're trying to do with our kids in the first place? We often look to our culture to ask, okay, what should we do as parents? How do we behave in a way that gets our kids to be able to interact in this social world, to meet the cultural expectations of our society and be able to survive? So again, if we're going to open up a conversation on parenting, how many books are there on that? You do not want me sitting here all day talking about it. But just think about your parents as your primary agents of socialization. Who first taught you your ideas about things like religion or what you should do with your life or what matters in life or whether or not you should get married or any of these things that your parents might influence you upon? They've taught you right and wrong. They've taught you morality. All of their teaching, all of that socialization has structured your personality. And so our children, whether or not we want to admit it, our behavior toward our kids structures their personality, both to the extent that we are kind of molding their behavior and then their general sense of how they should also act, but we're also molding what's going into their head. We're teaching them our ideas, our beliefs, our ideologies, a way of thinking. And so, in that sense, we have great influence over our kids, but we also have control over the social context which we live in. What kind of a house do we live in? What kind of a family are we? Are we angry family? Are we happy? Are we supportive? What does the household environment look like? Is there drugs and alcohol abuse present? Is there physical and sexual abuse and violence? Or is it all families sitting around the table playing games every Sunday night and abuse has never happened? So our home life itself can then completely influence our children's emotional state, cognitive thinking, but also realize that kids are learning from us. They are developing also by observing and internalizing the information that they're seeing for themselves and also what we're teaching them. Again, that idea that kids are like sponges. So, our behavior, our way of managing conflict, our way of communicating, they're absorbing that, they're learning that. That then becomes the behavior that they later model and imitate. Hence, when kids grow up in broken homes, why do they have trouble sometimes in relationships in the future more than other people that didn't grow up in broken homes? And again, a lot of this comes from, did they learn the social interaction that creates those positive relationships? And so not only do we have to consider how our parents, their parenting styles, we also have to consider the home life, how we were raised, what we were surrounded like. And then as we're about to talk about the general larger community, the secondary socialization, the education systems, and the larger community that you guys live in. Okay. So again, when we look at parents, we can't just look at the immediate things like how they're raising us and how they treat us and whether they were good to us and whether they beat us or whether they were just super nice all the time and hugged us constantly or whether it was a little bit of a mix of both. Sometimes you got spanked, but it was really only when you went too far. And then in a second, we'll discuss, the morality of spanking or whatever. But, you know, all of these things influence you. But what also influences you is this larger social context, okay? The larger social context is also influencing your development. You are being socialized by the media, the education system, by the government, by your family, by religion, by all these institutions of society that then also structure your behavior. We have a law system, right? We have a system of laws. You guys follow the laws. You can form your behavior to meet the expectational needs. However, did you develop the knowledge of how you're supposed to behave? Do you know how to behave? Do you know how to get around in the world? These are ultimate questions. But again, the culture you live in, okay, the common way of life that you are socialized into highly influences the way you develop. The culture you grow up in, it influences again your elements of culture, your ideologies, your belief systems, your values, social norms, all these things you internalize that then structure your personality as you're developing. Think about the groups you belong to. Think about the things that you're interested in. Think about where you get the sources of your information. How is it influencing you? Like when you hear a certain style of music and all of a sudden you kind of are like that, or you see the way somebody dresses and you start dressing like that, or you see the way somebody talks and you start acting like that. And then to make it even more complex, when you get into all these sociological variables, like how does your culture and then the social class that you live in your race, for example, or your biological sex, how does belonging to all these groups then influence the way you develop? And so what gets more complicated is culture is diverse. So depending upon the country of origin you live in, you'll get socialized into a specific culture or the ethnic group that you belong to or the state that you live in or the city that you live in. Each little bit of these differences in things like region or groups you identify with create diverse cultural experiences that influence you in different ways. Again, if you speak Spanish or you speak Japanese, you speak a lot faster than someone who speaks English, for example. Why is this? Because of cultural differences. And so, does the language you speak associated with the way your brain is structured and your actual physical neural pathways? Yes. Okay. It gets very, very complex. So again, it's way too much for this lecture. How culture is a biopsychosocial process and that the culture you're socialized into influences the way you think and the overall structure of your brain. Very complex stuff. But where it gets more complex is each social class, for example, has its own type of culture. So if you grow up in a lower class culture, do you think talk, walk, act, behave is someone who grew up in an upper class culture or a middle class culture? So are things like the social class you grow up in associated with the culture you get socialized into, which is so associated with the your how you develop in the end? It absolutely does. Because where do you get your norms and values and things like that that structure the way you think in the first place? You get it from your culture. So depending upon the culture that you're socialized into, that dictates the type of information that has structured the way you think, walk, talk, dress, etc. Again, it's all super complex. I put up this picture here of that blending of sociology and psychology, right? Because it's individuals that go out and interact in the social world. It's individuals with our individual brains who then go out and use symbolic sounds from our mouth to make language, and then we, can make sense of meaning through language and interact with other people in the social context, the realm of sociology. But that social context that we're born into then influences us. Hence that cyclical social psychology, going from the social context to the individual, or the psychology of social behavior going from the individual to the social context. Again, all of it gets very complex. And then if you apply things like culture and parenting styles, you're going to see drastic differences. You can look at, parenting styles by country and you will see differences. Some countries are much more into discipline than other countries. Some countries are much more into creative for their kids than other countries. It's very different. And so, but again, the way you're raised then influences the way you end up parenting your kid. And then we end up with that social reproduction of parenting styles and family styles going on from generation to generation. Again, all of which is just so complex. And we'd be here for days talking about all the variables that influence family and then how the family influences you and then how you get influenced by your family, then go out in the social world and start a family and then influence your kids. It's just so completely complex. But what is important is, again, not only is your culture, your social class, your region, and things like that associated with the way you think, walk, talk, dress, your personality, because it does. Your culture influences your personality, how you present yourself, the way your body motions, whatever it might be. But all of this is also associated with your socioeconomic status. And your socioeconomic status is incredibly important. Um, one second, I just want to look at my battery really quick. I'm going to pause this for 1 second while I go fix the battery. I'm so sorry. Thank you. Sorry, thought I had more life in there than I did. But your socioeconomic status is also associated with development across the lifespan 100%. And it's to the extent that depending upon your socioeconomic status, it dictates things like how long you live. When you delve into things like why does a white male live longer than a black male, you have to look at things like racism and the stress that racism imposes, for one, because that epigenetically affects things like gene activation, increases heart risk and cancer. But also, since somebody that was black historically has been subjugated into the lower class, okay, if you take an entire race of people and you force them into poverty and you never let them out, how is that going to affect their health? How is that going to affect their development? What kind of schools did they have a chance to go to? Did they have access to be able to grow their brains as much as some other kid who had light colored skin that was male, for example? Again, historically, that's the way it kind of was in America. And whether or not that still exists is debatable, but racism completely exists and the oppression of minorities completely exists. So, I mean, is it really debatable? I guess there's some counter arguments to that, but the evidence speaks enough for itself to show you that, still a black man still lives less. It's like, why does a black female with a PhD more likely to lose her baby than a white female with only a high school degree? Even though a black female with a PhD has higher socioeconomic status, did they when they were young? Did that black female lack in nutrition when they were young? Does lacking nutrition when you're young associated with your likelihood to lose a baby, for example? And it is. Okay, your social class status, your socioeconomic status of your parents goes so far that it's associated with your overall intelligence. And this is sad because society doesn't invest in the kids in poverty as much. We don't push them into the better schools, and we don't try to develop their brains as much as kids in middle class or rich kids. And so as a result, you see inequality in IQ scores that is parallel to socioeconomic status. As socioeconomic status increases, IQ scores tend to increase also. Why is that? Is it because rich people are biologically smarter? No, it's that social context effect. Again, if there was a way to balance out all the schools so all the kids got the same type of high quality education, you would see everything just balance out. However, rich kids still can afford things like tutoring, which is why valedictorians of wealthy that go to wealthy schools score higher on SATs than valedictorians that don't go to school and as good of a school, for example. And again, there's just these socioeconomic effects. And it's weird to think that your socioeconomic status and your culture and all of these things can affect your brain development, but it does. And so again, the world is not fair. Not every kid has a chance. Not every kid has a safe home with parents that love them, despite their parenting style, whatever it might be. Not every kid has food today. And that's the number one thing associated with things like intelligence. Did you eat today? All right. So when we think about why are we talking about the social context in developmental psychology, again, how does the social context or how is it associated with things like your body's development, nutrition levels, brain growth, the type of information you're being stimulated by, the type, how much stimuli? Like wealthier parents talk to their kids 4 times as much than people that don't have as much money. Now, to answer that question is very complex. Why? Is it because they have enough money that they're home with their kids more? Is it because they have money so they're less stressed? I mean, we could go on for days talking about why this is. But again, just to kind of wrap up this idea that the social context, the cultural way of life you grow up in, your race, your region, your biological sex, your gender, the way we stratify into all types of groups, the religion that you identify or no religion that you identify, or the bands you like, all of these things are influence your personality, the way you behave, the way you think, the way you feel, your emotional state, the way your brain is growing, the way your body is growing. It is just so complex. The human existence, the human experience, and understanding people is just so hard to understand sometimes. All right. The book went off on a little bit of a discussion about corporal punishment. And again, is spanking acceptable? Does it serve our purposes? Does it get us what we want? And also spanking beyond that, should you hit your kids? Is that valid? Should child abuse be something that's justified, or should it be called child abuse for a reason? I mean, it depends on how back you go in history on the treatment of children, but in modern times, it is pretty much unacceptable in the US to do any form of physical harm to children. And even spanking over the years has become pretty taboo. Now, again, if we did a survey on spanking and we asked people, do you disagree or agree that spanking should be used? And then when should spanking be used, at what time, and to what extent, and how many spanks, and how firm, and how much pressure, and should you leave a mark? You'd have some various opinions on that. But again, I'll just leave it to you to ask, like, how does that affect kids? Does it give us what we want? Is it teaching the kid the proper behavior? Are they learning? And so again, I put in here reward systems and then teaching behavior versus structuring behavior. So when you get into like learning theories, right, and you get into classical conditioning and operant conditioning, and you get into rewards and punishments and positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement compared to punishment. You have all these different ways of trying to mold kids. That's the goal, right? Because if you're going to use spanking or discipline or positive, you're smart, you're doing that for a reason. You're trying to mold children, right? You're trying to mold their development to get them to develop on the pathway that you want them to go. But again, it's up to you really, because there's no right or wrong answer as to what's the best way to approach things. So if you're looking at positive reinforcement, that's when you add a stimuli, you give them a star when they do a good job. Negative reinforcement's confusing, but again, that's like if you want them to do a certain behavior, then to reinforce the behavior, you take a stimuli away. And the psychology books always use the alarm clock thing, right? If you want to increase the likelihood of you sleeping, then when the alarm clock comes off, you hit the snooze. The snooze removes the stimuli, which then increases the behavior for sleeping. Punishment's a little bit different. Again, spanking is a form of punishment. You're like, is all form of punishment to hurt the child? Is a good question. And I don't know if that's a valid thing that everyone's going to agree on, but I think that's a good question to be asked. Is the goal of punishment to hurt the child? And you could say it's to teach a behavior, but does it succeed? And so you have positive punishment where you add a behavior, like you hit them to get them to do what you want or to stop a behavior, to decrease a behavior. Okay. And then you have negative reinforcement where you take something away, like you take away their food and then you send them to their room because they were like too loud at the dinner table or something along those lines. And so generally those are the four types of approaches that we can take to mold kids. Either give them a reward like a star, take away something to increase their behavior, or we can decrease their behavior by adding a stimuli like punching, hitting, kicking. Again, we have to talk about child abuse because it's about to come up. I mean, you got to ask, why do parents hit their kids? I mean, if 1 out of 5 kids are experiencing some type of abuse, physical or sexual abuse, like this is happening. Parents are using their bodies to try to get a kid to stop doing something. And again, in a second, we'll talk that it's babies 0 to 1 that are the most likely to be abused. But again, why? It's because the parents are trying to decrease a behavior, either get them to stop crying or whatever it might be. And again, we'll talk about in a second why that is the case. But again, if we're talking developmental psychology and we're going to incorporate things like learning theories, again, our goal is to mold the kids. Parenting styles, mold the kids. The socialization process by agents of socialization like parents, peers, education system, friends, siblings, that all structures us also. And then we also have these forms of rewards and punishments and asking the question, but again, the goal of all of this is to mold our kids to what we would say influence their development, right? And again, same thing with siblings. So with siblings and then your peers, you have that's when the children have a lot of time to interact with other people. And through with your siblings, just like with the interaction in the social context, they influence you. They influence your personality. They influence the way you behave, what you find important, the games that you like to do. The book also discusses how it teaches you to cope with conflict at an early age because, I never get between my best friends that are brothers ever. Yeah, I've just learned never get between the brothers. They have their own way of coping with conflict that I did not grow up with. And so I do not understand their processes. You know what I mean? I don't even try. I had a sister. We were always nice to each other. We still are. We do not fight. I just love her. And so with her, I never really had a chance to learn to cope with conflict. I had to learn to do that with my friends a little bit when I got older, and I was not good at it, probably because I never fought enough with my sister alone, good with coping with conflict, for example. But again, how do your siblings introduce you? Like my sister introduced me to kindness and love, but she also introduced me to Pearl Jam, Metallica. So it was the 90s. So again, you got to be thinking about all of these influences that structure your development, whether it's your parents, your peers, your siblings, your workplace, your education system, the media that you get, the country that you live in, the culture that you live in, whether you're a boy or a girl, the gender role socialization. That's what I keep meaning by biological sex or gender when I keep saying that. It's that once you are grouped or categorized as some kind of a sex or gender, then that process of gender socialization takes over, and society and agents of socialization then expect you to develop in a way that meets the expectations of social norms. And then historically, when people deviated from those social norms, then we sanctioned them. In modern times, our idea about gender has completely shifted, which will come in a little bit later of a lecture. And our knowledge about gender and sexuality has totally grown. Like when I used to teach, psychology and sociology, I'd ask how many sexes are there, and now the answer is at least the three, probably over 100, because there's so many different forms of intersex, combinations of genitalia and chromosomes and gonads and hormones, and it's just so completely wild out there. It's like the Wild West of learning these days. I'm having to catch up myself. But I won't distract you guys with that today. We'll just stay on track here. But so in here, I put parenting and families, creating supportive higher order context from this book, and from our book, and I also put up this book cover of Unequal Childhoods. Again, that association between social class, race, and family life. What happens when you stick entire families in poverty because they're Black or they're Asian or they're Native American or they're Hispanic, and you don't let them get out of poverty? How does that affect the family? How is that associated with things like the stress level of the family and whether or not they're even home to see their kids because they're always working? And how is that associated with whether they have access to health care and prenatal medicine and prenatal care and all of these things that influence development? Again, so it's incredibly complex. We have to realize that society is not fair, that some families have more than others. And again, as I was saying, depending upon your socioeconomic status, your race, etc., a lot of that dictates, your overall access to rising up the social class ladder, to be able to access the things that help us live for a long time and live healthily. So the book talks about the contextualist perspective. Again, thinking about the social context. What role does it play in development? How does everything out here structure us? How does it influence us? Yes, we are observing and thinking for ourselves, but our ability to think for ourselves doesn't really come until a lot later in life. I mean, your prefrontal cortex is still growing till you're 25. So again, so much of what you've absorbed is an unconscious process. Your brain has unconsciously been organizing information since you were born, and that has influenced you, and it continues to influence you. Okay. So again, these status hierarchies that the book talks about, you live in a social class system, right? That consists of social classes that are unequally distributed, meaning some people belong to the poor social class, some in the middle, some to the upper, some everywhere in between. Okay. Where you're located in that class system is associated with your access to resources like a good quality education, a good job, to get that money, to get that health care, to get good quality food. Okay. Inequities exist. Okay. This world is not fair. Just look around you, drive in your car, go around the city. You'll go from a rich neighborhood to a poor neighborhood to a middle class neighborhood, all within 15 minutes. As we've said, there's other factors like prejudices and stereotypes. Again, the prejudice against being disabled or against being Black or against being female. All of these factors are associated with whether or not you can rise up the social class ladder. Women still make less money than men, and a Black woman makes less than a white woman because of the intersectional layers of race and biological sex. So again, if you look at pay rates, why does a white man make $1? Um, a white woman only makes 80 cents to a man's dollar. A Black woman makes 67 cents to a man's dollar. And a Hispanic woman only makes 60 cents to a man's dollar. Again, a lot of this has to do with prejudice built into our social system, which is then associated with your ability to rise up the social class ladder and how long your family in America has even had a chance to rise up the social class ladder. Because again, if you weren't white pre like 1960, you were not allowed to become a manager, to get a good job. You were not going to have that kind of access. that meant your family was completely stuck in poverty. And as a result, you have all the detrimental effects that come with poverty, living with higher crime, living with higher drug rates. All of these things come where there is crime, where there's poverty, not having as good of schools, not having as good of teachers. All of that affects development, our personality, and the culture that we grow up in. Again, the culture of poverty is different than the culture of the elite. The way they live, walk, talk, their access, their ability to do things is completely different. So again, we have to ask that bigger question. How does that social context affect families? And then how does that social context affect kids? And then how does the social context affect the parents who are then teaching the kids? Again, it's super complex. Your book just does a couple of comments about this, but again, this idea of race and gender and religion and regions and country lines on a border, so much of these are social constructions, things that humans created. They don't have to exist, but they do. We could deconstruct race and racism to make a more equitable world, but the fact is it exists in modern times and it affects people. The book definitely asks questions like, how can we make it better? And again, I point to not every kid has the same educational opportunities. They don't all have the same chance for brain growth to become the next, Albert Einstein or Lydia Sebastian, the geniuses of our world. Not every kid has enough food to eat, which then is associated with how or well they develop. Okay. Not every kid's growing up in a great house, depending not no matter the social context. There are rich kids who get abused, there are poor kids who get abused. It's very, it's hard. So we always want to think of childhood as this happy time, but we have to realize that, there's a lot of trauma that exists in the world. About 1/5 of kids are experiencing some trauma, and not just trauma from things like, the effects of poverty or violence and abuse, but again, also things like divorce. So again, if we look at families and we look at all the different types of families, you have two-parent married households, two-parent cohabitating households, two-parent blended households, two-parent same-sex couples, two-parent interracial couples, single parents of all different types and kinds. Again, each one of those are associated with subtle differences because of these intersectional layers of diverse cultures and diverse experiences and diverse experiences of stigma. Like some kids who grow up in an interracial marriage might experience stigma because historically that was taboo. Like if a black person tried to get with someone who was white back in the day, they might have just lynched them. That's the America that we grew up in. And albeit lynching is not something that happens like it did back, in 1960s and prior to that, still interracial couples experience stigma and their kids often experience stigma also. Same thing with same-sex couples. Divorced kids used to be one of the most taboo of all. Like that was so traumatic on kids. The embarrassment, the status alone from having divorced parents used to be devastating on kids. And whether or not that's true anymore is different because again, divorce is so much more the norm. If you look at some of the statistics that say like white families, 80% of them at some point will get divorced. Half of blacks and Hispanics will get divorced. That means a lot of kids are experiencing that kind of thing. So again, it's hard to answer what's the best family type. Is two parents important compared to one? And again, that depends on the household. But again, families that tend to have two parents that are married tend to have higher socioeconomic status. And then single moms, for example, tend to have lower socioeconomic status than single dads or married people. And so again, how is being a single mother associated with things like the feminization of poverty, right? Like, so do women after a divorce tend to get stuck with the kids? How does that affect their career? How does that affect their socioeconomic status? And then the kids that are growing up in single mom households with lower socioeconomic status, they're more likely to be in poverty. How does that affect their overall outcomes? So again, it's very complex, all of the effects. But as some general statistics, in 1960, almost all families were married. By 2008, 70% were married. By 2017, 65 live with two-parent married households. Those stats don't say whether or not they have been divorced prior, but in general, you're starting to see you've seen a reduction over the decades. And now we're getting, 65%, it's going down. So that means a lot of kids are starting to grow up with either a single parent or cohabitating parents or different family types other than that traditional two-parent head of a household kind of thing. All right. Now, again, with divorce, we have to ask, how does it affect the kids? And I'm sure a lot of you can just look around you and use your observations. What do you see? How well do the kids cope with it? What happens if they have to go split houses? What happens if there's a lot of animosity between the spouses? What if those kids experienced a lot of the conflict and witnessed a lot of that breakup, for example, and maybe the breakup was bad? The book, I put this quote in there because, like, this is hardcore for even a book to say this, but the book said that the consequences of divorce are only second to a parent dying. And I was like, man, that's harsh. But that's why I put that in quotes, because I didn't say that, but that's what the book says. So I mean, you can imagine that divorce can be pretty traumatic on parents and on kids and on socioeconomic status, because you no longer have those two-parent incomes sharing the bills. Now you have two parents paying their own bills, and depending on how much money each one of the parents have, and again, women tend to make less money, tend to get more stuck with the kids. You start to see the effects of that. Some of the short-term and long-term consequences of divorce: distress, school performance, difficulty with peers, lack of confidence, trust, self-esteem, social competence, behavioral problems, higher rates of sexuality at younger ages, higher rates of teen pregnancies, less likely to graduate, problems in future relationships. And then again, adjusting to divorce. How can we help kids adjust to divorce so that it's not so traumatic? The book suggests limiting conflict between parents, providing warmth, emotional support, helping with socioeconomic status, help them get a job and have some daycare where they can put their kids so if they have to go to work or whatever. And then in modern times, you're starting to see again a lot of changes like cohabitation. And cohabitation has its ups and downs. Again, if you're cohabitating but not married, you might have two people being able to contribute to the bills. But do cohabitating couples always stay together? And what happens if a kid gets attached to a boyfriend or a girlfriend of your parent, and then all of a sudden that person's gone? How did that affect him? What about remarriage? How does that affect him having step parents? If you like those, use those words. I'm not big on the labels or the categorizing, but step parent is a commonly used term to account for that. Um, how does that affect the kids? How does that change the dynamics of the relationships in the household? It's so complex. And then what happens if you have blended families where you have, families with all of their kids coming from different areas, different relationships, all then coming together? And then the book talks about 1 in 6 kids are living in these blended families. It was pretty equal across the board for Hispanic, Black, and white. But again, you're going to see a lot less divorce races and things for like Asians. And same thing with like child abuse and stuff like that for Asians. They hit their kids a whole lot less. You have to ask questions like why. Again, culture is your number one culprit there. Your book gets into maltreatment, adversity, and resilience of kids. Again, adversity is your kid's ability, or adults, I guess we're developmental psychology, across the lifespan, okay? I should expand everything we've said across the lifespan. So there you go. Everything about the social context influencing you and your parents and your peers, that it goes on forever. I did not mean to like limit that in any way if I did. But again, our adversity is our ability to get through things, get through the tough stuff. Resilient is you be able to cope with that, and child maltreatment, again, is the abuse that kids receive. Okay, whether it's verbal, physical, sexual abuse. 1 in 5 kids experience some form of abuse, whether it's neglect, physical abuse, or sexual abuse. Again, children in their first year of life had the highest rate of victimization. That means the babies. And you have to ask that question: why do humans hit their babies more than any other age? One, why do humans hit anyone in the first place is a whole other question of Is violence inherent in us? Is violence learned, etc.? That's a deeper conversation for today. How much of violence is nature versus nurture? You know what I mean? But again, violence does occur in families, domestically, from parents to kids, from spouses to people in relationships, again, across the board. Um, it's a sad idea that kids have to learn to have adversity to get through that kind of stuff and be able to cope with it. That always breaks my heart. I'm a professor because I don't have to see that every day. But like my sister, who's a social worker, she sees that every day of her life. She witnesses the effects of parents growing up rough and child abuse on the kids, and like I could never detach myself from the reality of what it is. um I also put a quote in here from your book talking about the stress systems. Again, when we experience things in the social context, that can influence stress, which then influences the brain, which then influences the body. And so again, not only does, you know, the way a kid grows up and the way people grow up, our experiences, and if we can label them as positive or negative, how do these affect us? How do our positive experiences in life help us get through things and be more resilient and be happy? But then how do our negative experiences us break us down and hurt us and make us want to cry? And so that's the human existence, though. It's this complete blend of sadness and trauma and heartache, but then love and happiness, right? And so, what can we do for people as they develop across the lifespan to balance that equation where we can, be resilient, have that adversity to be able to get through life without too much pain and heartache, except for the stuff that we all have to go through, like death, which is, always breaks my heart that, 30, 40 years from now, I'm not going to be here. All that's going to be left is this video. But again, I think about that stuff. Does every kid have a happy childhood? Is a happy childhood even important? Like when I teach marriage and family back in the day, there was no conceptualization of childhood. Nobody even cared about this idea of having a happy childhood. Kids were seen as like economic pawns that were just traded or used for workhorses. So again, this idea of childhood is relatively new when you look into the literature on that. It's a cool idea. And so again, how we view children, how we should raise our kids, what type of parenting styles we should take, this all shifts over time. This idea now that we're all these sweet, nurturing parents completely conflicts with the way my parents were and their parents were back in the day, where you could be characterized as is a little more harsh. And so again, this is just a quick introduction to family, and the effect that it has on kids, for example. I put up a couple other lectures on this also just to get you guys thinking about marriage, family, divorce, all the influence it has on children, how it influences us also across the lifespan. So again, all pretty complex stuff. And I'm just trying to scratch the surface of this a little bit for you. So if you guys need anything, let me know. But I really appreciate you listening to this lecture. Thank you.